Hi, everybody. This is Mrs. Prosser. I'm going to help you walk through some of Lesson 5. Some of you have had a hard time with this. Variables are a very new concept, and it's a little different than what you're used to in algebra. So in algebra, if you've done any sort of solving in algebra, you might have had like x plus 1 equals 2, for example. And let's say then, you're used to doing like minus 1 on each side, and then you get x is equal to 1. Now, that's great. I love algebra, but this is going to be a little different. Instead of us having to solve for x, we're actually going to be telling the computer what x is. So we tell it that. I don't know that it's worth writing that out. So instead of us solving for x, we're going to tell it what x is, and then it's going to use that data to do something. So let's take a look at what that means because it's a little weird, and at the same time it's really not too bad once you get the hang of it. So I'm going to move into lesson 5.3, and basically it starts us off. And if you're like, what is going on here with this text? You can switch between the blocks and the text up here. So if you would rather have blocks or if you'd rather have text, it's literally the same thing. It's just, it's not as colorful if you go with the text. So taking a look at this, this is saying here, var, variable, and we're calling this variable x position, which is kind of boring, is equal to 50. So here it says up here, do this, run the program to see how it works, run, change the number that is stored in the variable. And this is the number we're storing in the variable here. So we're saying this variable x position is equal to 50. Now, if I change it to 200, what will happen is, see here it says ellipse, the x position. So x, that is the ellipse's x position, and it's using... that's why I think this is why it's so confusing. I'm just going to call this cat for a second because it doesn't matter what you say. So now the x position of the ellipse is going to be equal to cat. And I've told it that cat is equal to 200. So now if I reset and do this, you'll see its x position has moved to 200. So it's moved over. If I wanted to change it, I could say, hey, I want the width and the height to also be equal to cat. In this case, that is 200. If I reset, you'll see I now have a bigger circle. If I change this to 10, if I reset, I'm going to have a very small circle. So var, when you create a variable with var, you're storing a value in that variable. So instead of solving for x, or cat in this case, we're saying x, or whatever you call the variable, that is equal to whatever you want. And then you can use that value, which is great because then instead of having to, let's say I wanted all of these to be equal to the same thing, instead of going and manually changing them all to 10, which is annoying, sometimes you just want to, I'm going to Command Z that, sometimes you just want to be able to change one thing and have it, where'd it go? Oh, it's there. I don't know why I didn't see it. Sometimes changing one thing will then allow you to automatically change other things when you're using variables. So it's a little confusing, but let's practice some more. So introduction to variables. Yeah, this is the same kind of thing. It's saying this variable is equal to 300. This variable is equal to 100. And then it's being used. Those two variables are being used here. Lesson 5, part 5. This, if you run it, you get a big old circle. And it's saying change the value, so the circle takes up the entire screen. So if you take a look at how, or where the variable is being used, the variable is being used here. And that, if you don't remember, if you look over here, it says the last two numbers are W and H, the width and the height of the ellipse in this case. They're going to be the same size, so that's a circle. But here, If we have it set to 450, these are both 450. If I set it to 200 and reset and run, it's going to be smaller. The width is now 200. The height is now 200 because I've set this variable to 200. So the variable is storing a value for you. It's just, instead of typing in 200 here, I'm changing it in one place. And then using that variable, ideally in multiple places. So let's go on. I think the other ones that are helpful, if you run this one, you have to change it so it looks a little more like a flower, I believe. And you're changing the petal size. So yeah, you'll adjust that so it kind of looks like a flower and not some weird just dot pattern. If I go on to part 7, this is kind of where it goes over what each of these is. So you can name a variable saying var this, variable, var cat. That would be, I'm creating the variable cat. Now, you actually have to then say equals something if you want to give it a value. Otherwise, you've just created a variable that has nothing stored in it. And then using it, the key is you have to make sure you're using the same exact word and spelling and capitalization. Otherwise, it won't work. And this is called initializing when you actually give it a value. That's not super important. The key is you should know that when you create a variable, it does not automatically give it a value unless you say it's equal to blah, 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 whatever. All right, other stuff. Let's see, 8 and 9 to wrap this lesson up. This one has multiple errors, and you'll see it won't let you go into block mode. So if you're used to the blocks, don't freak out that you can't change it to blocks, because what it's doing here is it wants you to look at where the errors are. Specifically, it says try to figure out what problems there are with the variable names. So these names of the variables, you're trying to figure out what's the problem with those. And you're just typing in things to adjust those names. Because remember, the names have to match, number one. And there's some rules, number two, about how you can, what you can call a variable. If you get stuck on this, if you click here on the hint, this is really helpful. It will tell you, hey, labels, the label or the name of the variable can't have spaces in it. It can't start with a number. And the capitalization and spelling must be exactly the same. Those are issues you'll see here, and that's what you have to fix. Lastly, number 9. Number 9 is about, this is the fun one with the eyes that change randomly. So right now it doesn't work. The random thing I know that some students have been a little confused about, but if I go in here to math, this is basically saying, okay, I'm going to have it set around, it's going to roll the die from number 1 to 10, and it's going to come up with a number from 1 to 10. So if I switch back to blocks, we'll see it's being used here. So it's saying the eye size is going to be randomly set from 10 to 60. Now, the problem right now is, let's see, it's set to a random number. Unfortunately, only one of the eyes is currently using it. So it wants you to change this so that both eyes use that random eye size. That way, it doesn't look quite so much like a monster when there's one big eye and one small eye. So try that out. You're going to be in the eyes section, changing that here in the eyes section. The rest of it's fine. You just need to change the other eye so they both get bigger and smaller at the same rate. And you just test it by running it over and over, and they should always be the same size. That's basically it for this lesson. This last part kind of reminds you of different rules when you're labeling variables and naming them. There's some different things like Camel Case is kind of cool. It's a term that's used in coding where you, it stands for like humps. If you imagine a camel has humps, um, camel case is when if you have multiple words in a, here, if you have multiple words, I'll just zoom in. I don't know if you can see that if I zoom in. But if you look right here, it says size of rectangle. When you have multiple words, camel case is when you capitalize basically every word after the first word. So there's like a hump or bumps for the capitals of the words that come after the first word. That's a really common way that people capitalize variables and other things in coding. You can also use underscores. That's another way that it's done, between words using underscores. Because remember, you can't have spaces. It's really important that you know you cannot have spaces in the names of your variables or labels. Anyway, I think that's about it. There's some lesson extras. I don't know if you guys can see this. I think so. And you can try out some different stuff if you'd like. But that's it for lesson 5. I'll have a separate video to give you some tips for lesson 6. Thanks.